The story begins with the frigid wind howled across a desolate, frozen landscape, carrying with it the scent of ozone and shattered ice. In the center of this frozen wasteland, the colossal form of the Ice Dragon Emperor, a beast of legendary SS rank status, lay crumpled in defeat. Its massive, scaled body, which had terrorized the region for centuries, now rested motionless against the jagged glaciers. Smoke rose from the battlefield, obscuring the figure standing before the fallen Leviathan. A solitary warrior stood amidst the wreckage, his silhouette stark against the blinding white of the snow. He surveyed his handiwork with a detachment that belied the magnitude of the feat he had just accomplished. To the rest of the world, this was a cataclysmic event, an impossible victory against a force of nature. Yet the warrior merely adjusted his collar, his thoughts already drifting away from the battlefield. He muttered to himself about the necessity of a swift departure, his mind preoccupied not with the glory of the kill, but with the inconvenience of the noise and the pressing schedule of the following day. He turned his back on the fallen emperor, his cape fluttering in the biting wind, as he mentally prepared for an event he deemed far more critical than slaying a dragon. The scene shifted dramatically from the harsh, frozen wilds to the warm, bustling interior of a modest tailor shop within the capital city. The bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of a customer whose presence seemed to suck the air out of the room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the figure standing at the entrance. The shopkeepers, a middle-aged man and woman, froze in their tracks, their eyes widening in disbelief. Whispers of recognition rippled through the air as they realized who graced their humble establishment. Standing before them was a young woman of breathtaking beauty, a figure whispered about in the highest circles of society. It was the daughter of the prestigious Orleans ducal family. The shopkeeper's assistant peered from behind a curtain, her jaw slack. The visitor possessed skin as pale and flawless as fine porcelain, earning her the moniker, the porcelain doll. Her eyes, framed by long, dark lashes, shone with the deep crystalline blue of sapphires, while her hair cascaded down her back in waves of spun platinum silk. The young noblewoman, Letitia Orleans, stood with an air of perfect poise, her hands clasped demurely before her. The shopkeeper, overcoming his initial shock, bowed deeply, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He stammered his gratitude, hardly believing that a lady of her standing would commission a dress from a small, common shop rather than the exclusive boutiques of the aristocracy. He presented the finished garment with trembling hands, his eyes darting nervously to gauge her reaction. Letitia inspected the dress, her expression unreadable for a moment before a gentle, polished smile graced her lips. She nodded, signaling her approval. The shopkeeper exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Letitia assured him in a soft, melodic voice that she would return, her tone carrying a practiced elegance that charmed everyone in the room. As she turned to leave, the onlookers murmured in admiration, captivated by her ethereal beauty and the serene aura she projected. They whispered the name given to her by the public, Belle Poupée, the beautiful doll. Men in the streets stopped to stare, hearts captured instantly by her fleeting presence. However, the tranquility of the public facade shattered the moment the heavy oak doors of the Orleans mansion closed behind her. Letitia marched into the drawing room where her parents, the Duke and Duchess, waited anxiously. The air in the room was thick with tension. Letitia dropped the heavy box containing the dress onto a table and stretched her arms high above her head, cracking her neck with a loud pop. Her posture slumped, the perfect elegance vanishing in an instant. She let out a boisterous laugh, slapping her back with a vigor that would have scandalized the shopkeepers she had just left. Her mother, Duchess Odile, looked on with a mixture of horror and despair, clutching a handkerchief to her chest. The Duke, a man of dignified bearing, watched his daughter with a weary expression. Letitia proudly displayed the dress, not as a fashion statement, but as a point of argument. She held up the garment, pointing out the exquisite stitching and the intricate embroidery, using it as physical proof to lecture her mother on the folly of judging quality by the size or reputation of a shop. She argued passionately that skill existed independently of prestige, her voice loud and confident. The Duchess, while acknowledging the quality of the dress, lamented her daughter's transformation. She wept dramatically, asking where she had gone wrong in raising her daughter, questioning why Letitia had grown up to be so manly and rough in private despite her angelic appearance in public. Letitia brushed off the criticism with a grin, declaring that for a woman, a dress was a battle uniform. She asserted her desire to live life on her own terms, to see things with her own eyes and make her own decisions, refusing to be bound by empty societal expectations. Her father, defeated by her logic and energy, simply agreed, knowing it was futile to argue. The Duchess, however, spiraled into a panic about the upcoming evening. It was the night of Letitia's engagement party, a political union of immense importance. She grabbed Letitia's shoulders, shaking her gently, begging her to maintain the doll persona at all costs during the event. She implored her daughter to be obedient, quiet, and decorative, terrified that Letitia's true, boisterous nature would scare away the fiancé. The conversation turned to the prospective groom, Prince Gilbert Rossman. The Duke mentioned the troubling rumors circulating about the second prince. Whispers in the court suggested that Gilbert was a man of loose morals, a frequent patron of brothels, and possessed a problematic relationship with women. Furthermore, there was the matter of his red eyes, a trait often viewed with superstition. Letitia listened, her expression shifting from amusement to calculation. She dismissed the concerns with a wave of her hand, stating that she would confirm the truth of these rumors herself. She viewed the engagement not as a romantic endeavor but as a mission to secure the best outcome for her family. Her confidence was unshakable. She promised her father she would bring back the best result for the alliance between the royal family and the House of Orleans. Her brother, standing in the background, looked on with a mix of amusement and resignation, well aware of his sister's formidable personality. The family prepared for the night, the Duchess offering one final, desperate prayer that Letitia would keep her mouth shut and look pretty. The setting shifted to the grand ballroom of the royal palace. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the assembled nobility, the air filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the rustle of expensive fabrics. Letitia made her entrance, descending the grand staircase. She was a vision of perfection, the porcelain doll, come to life. Her platinum hair caught the light, and her sapphire eyes scanned the crowd with practiced demureness. The crowd parted, whispers of admiration following her wake. Guests marveled at her beauty, confirming the rumors of the Orleans daughter's unearthly charm. She moved with a gliding grace, every step measured and precise. Yet, amidst the sea of adoring faces, one figure stood apart. Leaning against a pillar on the upper landing, looking down at the festivities with utter boredom, was Prince Gilbert Rossman. He was striking, with messy dark hair and piercing red eyes that seemed to burn with apathy. He wore his royal attire with a casual, almost sloppy disregard, his cravat loose and his posture slouching. Letitia approached him, executing a flawless curtsy, her face the picture of innocent delight. She introduced herself, her voice soft and sweet. Gilbert looked at her, his expression twisting into a sneer. He didn't bother to straighten up. Instead, he looked her up and down with cold scrutiny. The air between them crackled with tension. The surrounding guests watched with bated breath, eager to see the interaction between the doll and the problem prince. Gilbert spoke, his voice dripping with disdain. He told her flatly that he preferred mature, beautiful women and that she, a doll-like creature, was completely outside his tastes. He mocked her smile, calling it practiced and fake. He leaned in closer, his red eyes narrowing, and warned her not to lump him in with the other men she had wrapped around her little finger. He declared that her cute act would have no effect on him. Letitia's internal monologue flared with irritation, though her outer mask remained perfectly intact. She maintained her smile, but her eyes sharpened. Gilbert continued his tirade, his voice raising slightly so that those nearby could hear. He called her a wild horse, disguised as a domesticated pet. He laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. He announced that he had no need for a wife who was nothing more than a walking vase. He stated that if she wanted to annul the engagement, he would sign the papers immediately. He punctuated his insult by telling her to remember her place as a decorative object with no emotions. He turned his back on her, dismissing her completely. The crowd gasped, scandalized by the prince's rudeness. Whispers erupted like wildfire. They pitted Letitia, the poor doll princess, humiliated by the boorish second prince. Internally, however, Letitia was far from crushed. As she watched Gilbert's retreating back, her mind raced. She analyzed his behavior, dissecting his insults. He had called her a walking vase, a common insult, but he had also accused her of being a manipulator. She realized the rumors about his sharp tongue were true. But rather than feeling insulted, she felt a spark of intrigue. She noted that despite his sloppy appearance and rude words, there was a strange elegance to his movements. He held his wine glass with a delicate, refined grip, his pinky slightly extended, a sign of rigorous etiquette training ingrained into his muscle memory. She surmised that his sloppy persona was a deliberate fabrication, a shield he used to push people away. She watched him walk, noting the rhythm of his stride. It wasn't the walk of a drunkard or a fool, it was the measured pace of someone in control. Letitia made a split-second decision. Instead of retreating in tears as her mother would have expected, she followed him. She picked up her pace, trailing behind the prince as he navigated the corridors away from the main ballroom. Gilbert sensed her presence and stopped, turning around with an annoyed expression. He asked if she was a duckling following its mother. Letitia stopped, looking up at him with wide, innocent eyes, but her lips curled into a playful, almost teasing smile. She asked if he had learned his manners by teaching himself, poking fun at his earlier refined grip on the glass. Gilbert flinched, his composure cracking for a split second. A blush crept up his neck, and he looked away, clearly embarrassed that she had seen through his act. He grumbled, trying to regain his footing, asking her why she was still following him. Letitia stepped closer, dropping the pretense of the shy flower. She spoke to him directly, her tone shifting from the sweet doll to the confident woman she was at home. She pointed out that he wasn't actually a bad person, noting his embarrassment. She mused aloud that the rumors about him being a womanizer seemed exaggerated, as he appeared almost innocent in his reactions. Gilbert looked at her, truly confused now. He wasn't used to anyone, let alone a sheltered noblewoman, challenging him or reading him so accurately. He tried to brush her off again, telling her to leave him alone. He turned and resumed walking, faster this time. As they walked, the whispers of the servants and guards in the hallway reached them. The gossip was cruel. People whispered that the Duke of Orleans was selling his daughter for political gain, that the prince was twisted and cursed, and that the marriage was a sham. They called the Orleans family cold-blooded for sacrificing their daughter to such a man. Letitia ignored the voices, her focus entirely on Gilbert. She noticed that he didn't react to the insults either. He didn't flinch, didn't slow down, didn't show anger. He was completely desensitized to the malice directed at him. This realization struck a chord in Letitia. She understood that his twisted personality was a defense mechanism, a callous shell grown over years of being the subject of scorn and rumors. He expected everyone to hate him, so he gave them a reason to, controlling the narrative by being the villain they painted him to be. Gilbert stopped at a set of double doors leading out of the palace wing. He turned to Letitia one last time, his expression hardening. He told her his mood was ruined and that he was leaving. He pointedly stated he was going to a place not suitable for women. He invoked his reputation again, implying he was heading to the red light district, a brothel, to spend the night. He looked at her with a challenge in his eyes, expecting her to recoil in disgust and run back to the safety of the ballroom. He thought this would be the final straw that would drive her away. Letitia stood there, processing his words. The prince was going to a brothel. This was the perfect opportunity. The rumors she had discussed with her father, the ones about his racy nightlife, could now be verified firsthand. Moreover, the ballroom was suffocatingly boring, filled with people who only saw her as a porcelain doll. Here was a chance for adventure, for investigation, and to shatter the expectations placed upon her. A thrill shot through her. She looked at Gilbert, not with disgust, but with a sudden, intense excitement. She smiled, but this time it wasn't the practiced smile of the doll princess. It was a genuine, mischievous, almost predatory grin. She accepted his challenge. She stepped forward, her eyes locking with his red ones. She told him that if he was going, she was coming with him. Gilbert's jaw dropped. He stared at her, completely blindsided. He stammered, trying to process what the perfect noble daughter had just said. Letitia didn't wait for him to recover. She adjusted her dress, her mind already racing with the possibilities of the night. She declared that she would verify the rumors herself. She looked at him with a sparkling intensity, warning him not to regret his invitation. The background behind her seemed to bloom with flowers, but her aura was that of a hunter who had just cornered interesting prey. The prince, the villain of the court, found himself staring into the face of a woman who was far more dangerous and far more interesting than he could have ever imagined. The night was just beginning, and the porcelain doll was about to step out of her display case and into the chaos of the city, dragging the bewildered prince along with her. The scene froze on Letitia's exhilarating expression, a mix of cunning and joy, contrasted against Gilbert's stunned silence. The doll had cracked, revealing the vibrant, unstoppable force beneath, and the prince realized, perhaps too late, that he had underestimated the girl from the Orleans family. The wind outside might have been cold, but the fire in Letitia's eyes burned hot enough to melt the ice of the frozen north. A sensory overload that completely contradicted Letitia's expectations of a brothel. Instead of a dark, illicit den of iniquity, she found herself sinking into a realm of overwhelming softness and indulgence. A hostess with ample curves pressed close, her figure dominating the immediate view as she leaned in with a welcoming demeanor. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of luxury, and trays laden with vibrant, fresh fruits, grapes, apples, and pastries, sat upon the tables, glistening under the warm lighting. Letitia felt herself being swallowed by the plush sofa, a sensation she likened to falling into a physical paradise. She questioned her surroundings, bewildered by the sheer comfort and the unexpected wholesomeness of the hospitality. The hostesses, beautiful women with radiant smiles, surrounded her with an attentiveness that bordered on worship. One offered her a piece of fruit, urging her to eat, while another complimented the silken texture of her platinum hair. Letitia accepted the offering, the sweetness of the fruit exploding on her tongue as she chewed, her mind reeling from the contrast between the rumors and this reality. She sat sandwiched between these lovely women, her small frame almost disappearing amidst their soft embraces and the deep cushions of the sofa. She noted the softness of the seat and the enticing allure of the women, humorously acknowledging that if this was corruption, it was a delightful form of it that one could easily succumb to. In stark contrast to Letitia's pampering, Prince Gilbert sat on the opposite side of the table, his posture radiating a profound boredom and irritation. He rested his cheek against his fist, his dark hair falling over his eyes as he watched the spectacle with a detached, almost long-suffering expression. The hostesses fawned over Letitia, their voices rising in a chorus of high-pitched squeals of kaya and adoration, praising her cuteness as they fed her. One hostess, eager to participate, held a fork up to Letitia's lips, urging her to open wide for a bite. Letitia, caught in the flow of their affection, found the experience incredibly sweet, both literally and figuratively. Internally, Letitia began to dissect the situation. She observed Gilbert, who seemed completely uninterested in the beautiful women vying for attention. She realized that if she were to become his wife, she might be able to visit this paradise legitimately every day, a thought that brought a blush to her cheeks. She glanced at Gilbert again, noting his stoic silence. He wasn't playing around. In fact, he appeared to be deliberately keeping a respectful distance from the women next to him. This observation shattered the rumor of his lechery. If frequenting this establishment meant he maintained such a gentlemanly distance, she reasoned that his habit of visiting brothels might actually be a positive trait rather than a vice. The perspective shifted to the wider room, revealing a scene of relaxed socialization rather than scandal. Most of the patrons were simply drinking and chatting with the hostesses. However, the reality of the establishment did manifest occasionally. Letitia spotted a man and a woman walking hand in hand toward the back rooms, disappearing behind a heavy door, reminding her that this was, indeed, a place of business. Letitia took a sip of her drink, her sapphire eyes scanning the room over the rim of the glass. She admitted to herself that she had been tricked, or rather, she had deceived herself. She had anticipated chaos and debauchery, but the atmosphere was surprisingly healthy and calm. The air was filled with light conversation, not the heavy, illicit tension she had prepared for. The conversation at the table took a sharp turn when the topic of Letitia's identity arose. One of the hostesses, a woman with long dark hair, asked in shock if Belle was truly Gilbert's fiancée. Gilbert, his expression darkening, confirmed it with a dismissive wave of his hand. He described her as a prospective wife brought about by an arranged marriage, emphasizing that they had only just met that day. The hostesses looked between the two, confused as to why a noblewoman of the Orleans family would be in such a place. Gilbert cut them off sharply, telling them to stop asking unnecessary questions. However, the hostesses rallied to Gilbert's defense. One of them, looking earnestly at Letitia, assured her that Gilbert had never once laid a hand on any of the girls in the shop. She begged Letitia to be at ease regarding his fidelity. Letitia was struck by this unsolicited defense. She marveled that these women cared enough about the prince to vouch for his character so passionately. Gilbert, observing Letitia's reaction, felt a surge of suspicion. His red eyes narrowed as he scrutinized her. He vocalized his doubts, stating that the doll princess of Orleans had no logical reason to marry him. He cynically predicted that the engagement would be annulled quickly, suggesting that her presence here was part of a scheme to find a reason to discard him. He accused her of colluding with someone, his paranoia evident in his sharp tone. Letitia, however, was not listening to his accusations. She was captivated by his eyes. Seeing them up close for the first time, she was struck by their intensity. They were not merely red, they were a deep, crimson shade that seemed to glow with an inner light. She found them arrogant, strong, and deeply mesmerizing. She felt as though she could melt into that color, describing it internally as more beautiful than any gemstone she had ever seen. Gilbert, unnerved by her intense stare, asked her what she was looking at, demanding to know what kind of creature she was to stare at him so boldly. Letitia simply replied that his eyes were beautiful. Gilbert recoiled, his composure cracking. He accused her of lying. He commanded her not to look at him with those eyes, clearly disturbed by a compliment directed at the very feature he believed to be his curse. The narrative then delved into the history of the curse of the red eyes. Gilbert, unable to handle her gaze, stood up and stormed away, disappearing through the doors at the back of the club. Letitia watched him go, her mind turning to the research she had conducted. She recalled the historical documents she had read when the engagement was first proposed. The history of the Rossmann Empire was stained with blood, and every major tragedy, a foolish king starting a war for love, a traitor overthrowing the dynasty, a madman poisoning his siblings, was linked to a royal born with red eyes. These individuals were branded as the cause of the nation's decline. This mutation appeared cyclically, affecting children born to parents with normal eye colors. The resemblance to blood invoked a primal fear in the populace, leading to the belief that these children were possessed by demons. Over time, what began as coincidence solidified into a terrifying superstition. These children were labeled cursed children. Letitia, however, viewed this with a rational, almost pitying lens. She considered the superstition ridiculous. She theorized that the madness of these historical figures was not a result of the eyes, but of the isolation and abuse they suffered. She reasoned that if a child is treated like a monster, isolated, and denied affection, they will inevitably develop behavioral issues. She blamed the stupidity of the previous royals and nobles for creating the very monsters they feared by alienating these children. Back in the present, Letitia sat alone with her thoughts for a moment before the hostesses surrounded her again. Laura, a blonde hostess with a cheerful demeanor, jumped in to comfort her, assuring her that Gilbert would return soon. She offered to keep Letitia company until then. Laura revealed that the reason so many girls had gathered at their table was because Gilbert was the benefactor of the shop. This term piqued Letitia's interest. Another hostess, Ari, teased Laura for monopolizing Letitia, complaining that usually girls wouldn't sit at a table unless requested. Ari pouted, saying she also wanted to serve Belle, accusing Laura of playing dirty. Laura flushed, embarrassed, and tried to hush them, realizing she had spoken too freely about the shop's internal workings in front of a noble. Letitia, sensing a trove of information, gently pressed Laura to continue. She asked to hear the story of Gilbert, her voice soft and encouraging. Laura, overwhelmed by Letitia's beauty and kindness, stammered that she would tell her everything, unable to refuse the request of such a lovely lady. Laura explained that the shop used to be a gathering place for thugs. She described the clientele as freelance knights or mercenaries, men who pledged no loyalty to any nation and performed various tasks from guarding to hunting magical beasts. While the profession was diverse, the ones who frequented the shop were low-ranking, rough, and violent men who earned little money. Laura recounted the dark days when the shop was unsafe, filled with men whose behavior could not be described as decent. The hostesses lived in fear of these patrons. But then Gilbert arrived. Laura described the transformation with awe. When Gilbert drove the thugs away, the relief was palpable. He took the most prominent seat in the center of the shop, and his presence alone elevated the atmosphere to that of a royal drawing room. News that the shop was favored by the second prince spread rapidly. This branding changed everything. The low-class clientele was replaced by high-ranking customers seeking to be where royalty was. The royal brand worked a miracle for their business. Laura added that Gilbert didn't just sit there, he actively taught them how to interact with customers, instructing them in etiquette and conversation. Another hostess, trying to clarify the nature of these lessons, bluntly stated that Gilbert simply didn't sleep with them. Laura corrected her, emphasizing that he taught them manners and communication skills to improve their standing. She insisted that Gilbert's intentions were pure and that he wanted to impart good things to them. Letitia absorbed this information, looking at Laura's earnest, blushing face. It was clear that these women adored him. She realized that despite his villainous reputation, Gilbert was a man of kindness and seriousness. The fact that he could inspire such loyalty and affection in these women spoke volumes about his true character. Letitia felt a warm sense of pride swelling in her chest regarding her future husband. Suddenly, the hostesses distracted her with more food, offering chocolates and fruits, determined to fatten up the slender princess. But their ministrations were interrupted by Gilbert's return. He placed a plate on the table with a clatter. Letitia looked down and gasped. It was a perfectly formed omelette, its golden surface smooth and unblemished, topped with a rich, glossy demi-glace sauce that shone under the lights. The vibrant red of the ketchup rice peeking out contrasted beautifully with the yellow egg. Letitia realized that when Gilbert had disappeared into the back, he hadn't gone to sulk, he had gone to the kitchen to have this made. She stared at the food, her mouth watering. It looked irresistible. One of the hostesses asked if it was for Letitia. Gilbert, looking away with a flushed face, stammered a denial. He claimed he had just, accidentally, made an extra portion while making his own. The idea that he, accidentally, made a whole separate plate of gourmet food was laughably transparent. Letitia stared at the plate, then at Gilbert. He sat down and began to eat his own portion, ignoring her. She felt a pang of injustice. He had placed this delicious-smelling food right in front of her nose and was now eating without inviting her to join, which she likened to a form of torture. She lamented internally that she hadn't eaten at the party because she had been too busy observing him. Gilbert, without looking at her, broke the silence. He grumbled that she hadn't eaten anything yet, pointing out that her habit of watching people instead of eating was why she was so small and skinny. He told her to eat, his voice gruff but the intent caring. Letitia beamed, her face lighting up with a genuine smile. She thanked him, realizing that his roughness was a cover for his attentiveness. She understood now, noticing that she was hungry and ensuring she was fed was his way of showing care. Laura, seeing an opportunity, offered to feed Letitia the omelette. She felt guilty for eating while Letitia had nothing, and wanted to make up for it. Gilbert snapped at Laura not to spoil Letitia, insisting she could eat by herself, But Laura ignored him, her ears, which turned out to be part of a costume or perhaps a beastkin trait, drooping with guilt. Laura insisted it was her job to serve. Letitia took a bite of the omelette and was transported. The egg was fluffy and soft, melting in her mouth, while the sweetness of the meat in the rice spread across her tongue. It was a flavor explosion. She felt she could eat an infinite amount of it. The demi-glace sauce added a depth of flavor that was exquisite. She praised the shop's chef, remarking that they must have hired someone incredible. Gilbert, hearing her praise, mumbled into his hand, "It's nothing." He clarified, somewhat defensively, that he was the one who made it. Letitia froze, her spoon hovering midair. She asked him to repeat himself. Gilbert, refusing to make eye contact, stated that he made it only because circumstances forced him to. He added that if it didn't suit her palate, she could just leave it. Letitia was stunned. The Prince of the Empire had personally cooked for her. She quickly assured him that it was delicious, denying any dislike. Gilbert, hiding his face which was now red with embarrassment, simply muttered, "Is that so? If so, then good." Letitia watched him, thinking that his shyness was incredibly cute. She admitted to herself that cute men were her weakness. However, her mind quickly pivoted back to the circumstances he mentioned. She connected the dots. The assassination attempt that had shaken the Empire, the great poisoning incident, remained unsolved. The culprit was likely a member of the royal family, someone with power and access. Since that day, Gilbert had been unable to eat food prepared by others for fear of poison. This explained why he hadn't touched his wine at the party. He was forced to learn to cook for his own survival. Letitia looked at him with a newfound depth of understanding. The phrase, "circumstances forced me," carried a heavy, tragic weight. It meant that in his entire world, there was almost no one he could trust. He was surrounded by enemies, even in his own home. He was utterly alone. Letitia made a decision. She looked at the space between them on the sofa. Slowly, deliberately, she shifted her body, scooting closer to him. Gilbert flinched, startled by the sudden proximity. Letitia didn't retreat. She sat close to him, her presence a silent vow. If he was alone, she would fill that void. She would be the one person he could trust, the one who would ensure he wouldn't be hurt anymore. She resolved to carefully, patiently, close the distance between them, both physically and emotionally. The chapter ended with the image of the doll princess and the cursed prince, sitting side by side, the barrier between them beginning to crumble under the weight of a shared meal and a silent promise. The opulent drawing room was thick with the hushed, excited murmurs of high society, the air perfumed with the scent of tea and the subtle tension of gossip. Seated upon plush sofas, a group of noblewomen engaged in a conversation that centered on a figure of almost mythical repute, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers as they discussed the lineage of the Orlesian family. One of the ladies, realizing a potential faux pas regarding the topic of the Orlesian house in the presence of Belle, quickly offered a polite apology, her hand fluttering to her chest in a gesture of social preservation. Belle, the focal point of their attention, sat with an air of practiced innocence, her expression betraying nothing as she claimed ignorance regarding the subject at hand. The conversation, however, was like a runaway carriage, inevitably steering toward the enigmatic figure known as the Ice Dragon Emperor. The ladies painted a vivid verbal portrait of this legendary mercenary, their words weaving a tapestry of awe and romanticized danger. They spoke of his title, a name earned through his supernatural ability to command ice dragons with absolute freedom, a power that placed him above the natural order of warriors. The descriptions grew more fervent, detailing a beauty that transcended gender, a visage so captivating that it ensnared the hearts of men and women alike, leaving them spellbound in his wake. They described his hair as a cascade of silver that seemed to catch and amplify the light of the moon, glowing with an ethereal luminescence. He was not merely a soldier, he was an SS-rank mercenary knight, a designation that spoke of lethal efficiency, yet his origins remained a shroud of complete mystery, adding to the allure. His eyes were likened to cold sapphires, blue gems that held a freezing, detached cruelty that only heightened his appeal. To these sheltered nobles, his existence was akin to a brilliant star in the night sky, a celestial body that demanded the gaze of all who stood beneath it. The lady speaking turned to Belle, emphasizing that a noblewoman of such high standing would surely have little reason to cross paths with a mere mercenary, framing the question to highlight the social divide between their world and his. Belle listened, her internal thoughts hidden behind a mask of polite engagement, though a flicker of recognition or perhaps amusement danced unseen in her eyes. The noblewoman berated herself for her carelessness, apologizing for bringing up such a rugged topic, yet she could not suppress the thrill of the gossip, lamenting that she had spoken out of turn. Seated nearby, Prince Gilbert listened to this adulation with a darkened expression, the praise heaped upon this Ice Dragon Emperor, serving as a sour contrast to his own mood. The ladies continued, fixating on the detail of the silver hair, a trait that sparked a specific rumor connecting the mercenary to the illustrious Orlesian family. They turned to Gilbert, seeking his opinion on the matter, perhaps oblivious to the growing storm cloud on his face. The rumors suggested a scandalous connection, whispering that the Ice Dragon Emperor might be an illegitimate child or a secret relation to the Orlesians due to that shared characteristic of silver hair. Gilbert's mind raced with cynical analysis. He considered the absolute control of information required to keep such a high-profile figure's identity secret. He mused that this mercenary was likely the eccentric hobby of a bored high noble, or perhaps something entirely non-human, a monster masquerading in the guise of a man. To him, the proliferation of rumors without a single concrete fact about the man's identity was suspicious, a deliberate obfuscation that reeked of political maneuvering. Belle, noticing his sullen demeanor, teased him gently, remarking that a man consumed by jealousy presented an unsightly image, her voice carrying a playful lilt. She questioned if his harsh assessment of the mercenary stemmed from the fact that she, Belle, was present to hear the other women fawn over another man. Gilbert deflected, insisting that regardless of his personal feelings, a person with no clear identity was inherently suspicious and untrustworthy. His judgment was absolute. The man was a dubious character. The tranquility of the high society gathering was shattered in an instant. A violent, concussive impact rocked the entrance, the sound of wood splintering and heavy boots slamming against the floor echoing through the room. The refined atmosphere evaporated, replaced by sudden, sharp panic. One of the women stammered, claiming it wasn't intentional, while the intruders, a group of massive, rough-hewn men, scanned the room with predatory intent. They barked orders to one another to search the premises, their voices grating and loud, utterly out of place among the velvet and silk. Belle's gaze sharpened as she assessed the threat, her body tensing instinctively. The intruders were not merely lost patrons. Their demeanor was aggressive, their eyes scanning the terrified guests like wolves selecting a lamb. One of the thugs locked eyes with a woman named Alicia, his voice dripping with a mocking familiarity as he greeted her, asking after her health with a sneer that suggested a dark history. The heavy thud of his boot on the floor punctuated his intimidation. Alicia, trembling but attempting to maintain the dignity of the establishment, tried to enforce the rules. She stammered that if they wished to enter, they must first complete the proper procedures at the reception desk, a futile attempt to apply civilization to barbarians. She asked what they needed, her voice wavering under the weight of their looming presence. The thug laughed off her formality, complaining about her cold reception, claiming he had come all this way specifically to see her, his tone implying a possessiveness that made the air turn frigid. In the background, Belle observed the scene with a critical eye, her internal monologue revealing a sharp, tactical mind. She noted the shaking of the other girls, recognizing it as a normal fear response, while promising silently to stay by their side. The thugs were identified as low-ranking mercenaries who had once frequented the establishment when it was a lesser venue. Belle recalled that as the establishment's class and price had risen, these men had been priced out, unable to afford the company of the ladies any longer. She deduced with cold logic that men of their caliber could never save enough coin to legitimately pay for services here. Their presence was an anomaly. The staff had believed they were rid of this trash, yet here they were, reeking of violence and arrogance. These were men known for their domineering attitudes and casual use of force. Gilbert rose from his seat, his movement abrupt and decisive. The women whispered his name in shock, realizing that the prince himself was stepping forward to intervene. It was unheard of for royalty to dirty their hands in a brawl, yet Gilbert moved to shield the women, his posture radiating a defiant authority. He challenged the thugs, demanding to know why they were causing such a commotion now, questioning their logic. He reminded them of the absolute difference in social status that governed the land, asserting that in this country, hierarchy was absolute. He warned them that if they dared to cause further chaos, they would face severe consequences, asking if they even realized who they were standing before. The lead thug, a massive brute with a scarred scalp, simply smirked. He acknowledged Gilbert not with fear, but with a contemptuous familiarity, addressing him as Prince Gilbert. The shock in the room was palpable. The thug knew exactly who he was threatening. A bystander whispered in disbelief, pointing out Gilbert's royal lineage, questioning if the thug was insane. Gilbert's eyes narrowed, his gaze locking onto the rough hand the thug had laid upon Alicia. He commanded the man to stop immediately, declaring that the mere act of touching her was unforgivable. He stated that such behavior could not be overlooked, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. The thug mocked him, feigning terror with exaggerated gestures, while Gilbert ordered Alicia to retreat behind him. Alicia hesitated, asking if she should just follow, while Gilbert reiterated his command for the thug to release her hand. He warned the man to prepare himself for appropriate punishment. Internally, however, Gilbert was calculating the grim reality of his situation. He regretted not bringing his Orlesian guards, realizing his vulnerability. He understood that he had no choice but to act personally, despite the lack of any protective detail in the vicinity. The thugs began to chuckle, a low, menacing sound that rippled through their group. The leader challenged Gilbert, asking exactly who would punish them and by what means, exposing the prince's lack of immediate power. Gilbert stood his ground, cracking his knuckles, a physical signal of his readiness to fight. Belle watched him, asking what he intended to do. Gilbert replied with a grim determination, stating that he was a man who advocated for gender equality, implying he would fight regardless of the odds. The thugs jeered, sarcastically praising his decision. Gilbert retorted, questioning if the lack of guards mattered, pointing out that they knew his identity and were still causing a disturbance. He proclaimed his name and title, Gilbert, the second prince of the Rossman Empire, using his lineage as a weapon and a shield. The response from the thugs was a chorus of derisive laughter. They cackled, their faces twisted into ugly masks of amusement. Gilbert faltered slightly, surprised by their total lack of deference. The leader confirmed that they were fully aware of who he was. He explained their twisted logic. Since the prince had started frequenting the establishment, low-lives like them had been pushed away, the place becoming too exclusive. They reasoned that if they humiliated the prince publicly, dragging his authority through the mud, the establishment's prestige would plummet, making it accessible to them once again. They blamed Gilbert for being a nuisance to their lifestyle. The realization hit Gilbert. They were prepared for the consequences because they believed the reward, breaking the social barrier, was worth it. He had warned them that touching a prince would be a major incident, but they didn't care. The leader cracked his neck, the sound sharp in the tense air, asking if Gilbert understood the situation now. He delivered a brutal verbal blow, stating that the consequences only mattered if Gilbert was actually respected as a royal. The physical altercation was swift and humiliating. Gilbert was shoved, grabbed, or struck, the details blurred by the speed of the aggression, but he managed to keep his footing, though he was visibly shaken. One of the thugs inspected him, noting sarcastically that his head didn't seem cracked and there was no blood. Their attention then shifted to Belle. The leader noticed her, calling her a new item, his eyes raking over her form with disgusting intent. Belle, maintaining her facade, cried out for Gilbert. Gilbert, recovering from the assault, threw himself between the thug and Belle, shielding her with his body. He gasped for breath, demanding they stay back. Desperate to use his remaining leverage, he shouted that the woman behind him was Lady Letitia of the Orlesian family, hoping the weight of her noble house would invoke fear where his royal title had failed. The thugs paused, but only to mock him further. The leader laughed, refusing to believe that the doll princess of the Orlesian family would be found in a brothel-like establishment. He dismissed Gilbert's claim as a desperate lie. Turning his full attention to the woman, he addressed her as Letitia, asking if she wanted to play with them. Another thug peered closer, recognizing her beauty and murmuring the name, Belle, the doll princess. Belle's internal narrative shifted drastically. She observed their barbaric behavior with cold detachment, labeling it as the actions of the weak preying on those they perceived as weaker. She analyzed their crude expressions, finding them revolting to the point of physical repulsion. Her patience snapped. She decided she could no longer stand by and watch. However, before she could act, Gilbert moved again. He grabbed her, pulling her close, his voice urgent and low near her ear. He instructed her to hide behind his back and, the moment she saw an opening, to run immediately. Belle was momentarily stunned. The prince, who had been humiliated and physically overpowered, was still trying to protect her. He expressed a loss of interest in the game the thugs were playing. Belle whispered a protest, asking how she could possibly abandon him. Gilbert misunderstood her hesitation, admitting that he never expected the doll princess to not despise him. He confessed, in this moment of vulnerability, that he had resigned himself to never finding a true fiancée, believing his life was merely an arrangement by his parents. Gilbert continued, his back to her, facing the thugs. He spoke with a heartbreaking resignation, saying that if he were to disappear as a useless person, it would perhaps be for the best. But he added he was tired. He wanted to thank her. He told her that even if he didn't know if he could return safely, he would formally annul their engagement upon his return to the palace to spare her. He didn't want her to be dragged down with him. He apologized for making her feel fear. Belle listened to his confession, her eyes widening. The image of the useless prince shattered, replaced by a man of integrity willing to sacrifice himself. Her demeanor shifted instantly. The fear vanished, replaced by a terrifying, cold rage. She analyzed the situation with new clarity. These low-life men daring to laugh at and strike royalty proved they were being backed by a powerful entity within the country. They knew attacking second Prince Gilbert would result in execution, yet they proceeded. This meant their goal from the start was a specific, disgusting script written by someone else. Someone was trying to assassinate him, or at least socially assassinate him, using these thugs as pawns. It was a set trap. No, Letitia decided she would not allow this. She refused to let them cause trouble for the shop she liked, but more importantly, she refused to let them touch the man she was now claiming. She told Gilbert to go outside. The thugs, oblivious to the predator awakening before them, suggested finding a private place to play, mocking the lonely prince. Suddenly, the leader froze. A hand, small but gripping with the force of a vice, clamped onto his wrist. The air in the room grew heavy with killing intent. Letitia's voice cut through the noise, low and dangerous, asking how they dared to touch her husband. The thug looked down, confused by the sudden resistance. Letitia commanded him to let go. The thug sneered, asking what the little lady wanted to play. He didn't finish his sentence. Letitia repeated her order, her voice devoid of warmth, stating that she had told him to release his hand and asking if he was deaf. She declared with absolute finality that no one was allowed to touch her husband without her permission. The pressure on the thug's arm increased. He gritted his teeth, shocked by the strength emanating from the slender girl. Letitia continued, her tone conversational yet terrifying. She asked if he still couldn't hear her even after she had spoken so clearly. She mused aloud if the arm was even necessary anymore. She threatened, with a chilling calmness, to chop it off and throw it to the pigs. The thug recoiled, finally sensing the monster beneath the noblewoman's skin. Letitia stared him down, her eyes glowing with a supernatural red hue. She chided him for being slow to answer, calling him an idiot. She glanced at Gilbert, deciding that letting a man like him face these brutes was a waste. She announced that she would be their opponent instead. As the thugs stared in confusion and dawning horror, Letitia revealed a secret of the high nobility. She informed them that those in the royal lines who possessed red eyes excelled not in brute force, but in intellect. However, the mana radiating from her suggested she was proficient in far more than just books. She promised to play with them until they begged for mercy, assuring them they didn't need to worry about the outcome, implying their destruction was guaranteed. The room, once a place of leisure, had transformed into an execution ground, and the doll princess held the axe. The tension in the room, previously suffocating under the weight of imminent violence, shifted abruptly as Prince Gilbert's lips parted. A single name escaped him, a whisper that cut through the cacophony of the thug's jeers, Letty. For Letitia, the sound of her name falling from his lips was a catalyst, shattering the persona of the detached Belle Poupée. A flush of heat rose to her cheeks, her heart skipping a beat as she processed the intimacy of the moment. She leaned in, her eyes shimmering with a dangerous mix of adrenaline and adoration, asking if he had finally decided to call her by her name, punctuating the question with the endearment hubby. Gilbert, however, was caught in a whirlwind of confusion and fear, his mind struggling to reconcile the fragile noblewoman he thought he knew with the entity radiating power before him. He stammered, his hand instinctively reaching for his neck as if to ground himself, his eyes darting between her and the looming threat of the mercenaries. He tried to interject, to demand an explanation for the madness unfolding, asking what on earth was happening. But Letitia cut him off, her voice firm yet laced with a terrifying sweetness. She commanded him to hide behind her back immediately. Internally, Letitia was fighting a war on two fronts. The physical threat of the thugs was negligible to her, but the proximity to Gilbert, his flushed face, his disheveled appearance, the vulnerability in his eyes, was testing her resolve. She confessed to herself that she wanted nothing more than to dote on him right there and then, her desire to comfort and claim him nearly overwhelming her sense of duty. The urge was unbearable. Yet, the harsh reality of their situation forced her to refocus. She acknowledged the prince's confusion with a brief, validating nod. Her gaze flickered past Gilbert to the terrified staff of the establishment. She saw the trembling figures of Alicia and Laura, huddled together in the background, their faces pale masks of dread. Letitia calculated the odds in a split second. If she did not resolve the situation immediately, the danger would spill over, consuming not just the prince but the innocent women she had come to know. She turned back to Gilbert, her expression softening into a maternal, protective reassurance. She instructed him to be a good boy and wait for just a moment, promising that she would end this quickly. Gilbert looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and resignation. He asked her if she truly intended to give up on everything, his voice trembling with the weight of his earlier despair. He looked like a man drowning in hopelessness, believing that any action she took now would only seal their doom. Letia's demeanor hardened, not towards him, but towards the world that had driven him to such a state. Her eye, previously obscured, snapped open, revealing a pupil that was distinctly non-human, a vertical slit glowing with arcane power. She vowed silently, with the ferocity of a dragon guarding its hoard, that she would never allow her husband to fall into such a pathetic, desperate situation ever again. She looked at him one last time before the violence began. The sight of him, fearful yet trusting enough to stay behind her, struck a chord deep within her. She brought a hand to her cheek, her internal monologue devolving into a chaotic stream of affection. She thought he was incredibly cute. The way he looked at her, the sheer vulnerability of his position, it was too much. Her focus wavered. The battle lust was momentarily eclipsed by an intense, heart-throbbing adoration. A metaphorical arrow of love struck her, leaving her stunned. She questioned the very laws of nature, wondering why such a lovable creature was allowed to exist. Her thoughts raced, spiraling into obsession. She couldn't stand it anymore. She wanted to strip him naked and explore every inch of him immediately, lamenting that not even a second could be wasted. The intensity of her doting desire was becoming a distraction, her mind consumed by his easy-to-bully, blushing face. The mercenaries, sensing an opening in the noblewoman's distracted state, seized the opportunity. The leader of the thugs, a massive brute with veins bulging from his neck, lunged forward. He roared in anger, insulted that the two were flirting in the middle of a hostage situation, completely ignoring the threat behind them. He called them idiots, swinging a massive fist intended to crush the small girl who dared to turn her back on him. But he had miscalculated fatally. Letitia did not even turn around. She didn't need to. As the thug's fist descended, the air temperature in the room plummeted to absolute zero in a heartbeat. From the empty space around Letitia's silhouette, jagged constructs of ice materialized with the speed of thought. They were not shapeless shards but formed the maw of a beast. She calmly explained, her voice devoid of fear, that her dragon possessed the ability to automatically attack and pursue any target that presented a threat. The thug's scream was cut short as the ice slammed into him. Letitia sighed, mocking his foolishness. She asked if he really thought a sneak attack of that caliber could harm her. She taunted him, calling it a pity, while still maintaining her commentary on how cute Gilbert was, completely bifurcating her attention between violence and romance. The thug flew backward, crashing into his cohorts with a pained yelp. The room erupted in a storm of frost. From the ether, 3 massive heads of ice dragons materialized, their jaws snapping with the sound of cracking glaciers. They hovered protectively around Letitia, their cold breath visible in the suddenly freezing air. The thugs stared in horror, the realization dawning on them slowly. The magic, the ice, the automatic defense. It was unmistakably the signature of the legend they feared. One of the mercenaries stammered, identifying the constructs as ice dragons, confirming that the woman standing before them was exactly like that person. Letitia turned to face them fully, the hem of her dress swirling around her like a storm cloud. She addressed the leader directly, identifying him as the fool who had caused a scene earlier and been demoted to E-rank for his incompetence. She scrutinized his face, feigning recognition, noting that he looked familiar. The thug could only gasp in shock, his bravado shattered. With a cold, analytical gaze, Letitia dismantled their operation. She surmised that they didn't even know the face of the person who had hired them. She laughed, a dry, humorless sound, mocking their ignorance. She deduced that they had received instructions via a letter sealed with a noble's crest, accompanied only by a deposit. That was all they were allowed to see. She confirmed her theory by the look of terror on their faces. They were merely disposable pawns in a mediocre plan hatched by someone far more powerful. She asked them condescendingly if they still hadn't figured it out, even after she had revealed this much. The thugs were paralyzed. They demanded to know who she really was. Letitia sighed, deciding that perhaps her current form was too confusing for their simple minds. She suggested that they might be more familiar with a different appearance. She reminded them that she had already introduced herself as Letitia of the Duke Orlesian family, also known as Belle Poupée, or the Doll Princess. Then, the atmosphere shifted violently. Magic, dense and suffocating, began to radiate from Letitia. A complex magic circle, glowing with a brilliant, icy blue light, expanded beneath her feet. Her silhouette began to blur and elongate. The delicate ribbons and frills of her dress seemed to dissolve into light. The thugs watched, their eyes bulging, their mouths agape as the petite noblewoman underwent a metamorphosis that defied reality. The light faded, leaving behind a figure that towered over the previous form. Gone was the doll princess in her dress. Standing in her place was a tall, broad-shouldered man with short, spiky hair, dressed in a sharp, masculine suit. He radiated an aura of absolute dominance. The thugs screamed in recognition, their voices cracking with terror. They identified him immediately, Ice Dragon Emperor. They questioned reality, asking if it was truly him. The Ice Dragon Emperor wasted no words. He raised a hand, palm facing the cowering group. With a single command, freeze, he unleashed a torrent of magic. Massive shards of ice erupted from the floor, engulfing the mercenaries in an instant. They were frozen mid-scream, encased in a prison of crystal, their limbs trapped, their threat neutralized in a fraction of a second. Silence returned to the room, broken only by the crackling of settling ice. Gilbert, who had witnessed the entire transformation, stood frozen himself, though not by magic. He stared at the back of the man who had just saved them. His eyes traveled to the man's hand, specifically to the ring adorning his finger. Understanding dawned on him. He recognized the ring as a gender reversal magic tool. The Ice Dragon Emperor turned, his face handsome and sharp, a smirk playing on his lips. He praised Gilbert, acknowledging that the prince's deduction was correct. He complimented Gilbert for his intelligence. He explained that the ring was indeed a family heirloom of the Orlesian house, a treasure capable of flipping the user's body into the opposite state. Gilbert, however, was not listening to the technical explanation. His face was bright red, a blush spreading from his cheeks to his ears. He stammered, unable to meet the Emperor's gaze. He asked why she felt the need to do this. Male Letitia leaned in, confused by the prince's reaction. She asked what was wrong with his reaction. She explained her reasoning simply. This form was far more convenient for her work. It allowed her to operate as a mercenary knight and help people without the constraints of her noble female identity. She claimed there was no grand reason behind it. She continued, adopting a casual, almost brotherly tone, telling Gilbert that with this tool, the mother and daughter dynamic of her family could be compromised. She explained that it was the duty of the strong to protect the weak. Furthermore, she revealed a more personal motivation. If she were to go out fighting in her original form as Letitia, her mother would cry until she ran out of tears. She mimicked her mother's weeping voice, recalling how her mother would lament a girl doing such dangerous things. Suddenly, male Letitia noticed Gilbert's intense blushing. A strange, confusing thought crossed her mind. She realized that Gilbert seemed to be enjoying this form, her male form, more than her female one. She felt a pang of complex emotions. When she was Belle Poupée, he had said she wasn't his type, yet now he seemed flustered. A wild, teasing idea formed in her head. She leaned closer to the flustered prince, suggesting that perhaps she should just play the role of the husband for him instead. Gilbert recoiled, shouting, "No, you can't do that," while picturing the male Letitia acting as a husband. At that moment, the leader of the thugs, who had only been partially frozen or had managed to break free of the initial blast, groaned. He was struggling against the ice, furious and confused. He shouted at them to stop joking around. Letitia, still in her male form, glanced back at him with annoyance. She drove another spike of ice into him to silence him, a casual, thwack, sound echoing as the thug yelped in pain. The thug leader, gasping for breath, tried to make sense of the situation. He looked at the male figure and connected the dots in the wrong order. He exclaimed that he understood now, it was all a setup. He accused the Ice Dragon Emperor of disguising himself as the doll princess, Belle Poupée, to infiltrate the establishment. He claimed to have seen through the plan, believing the emperor had been hiding inside the girl's appearance all along. Letitia stood over him, looking down with a mix of pity and amusement. She admitted that his interpretation was interesting. However, she corrected him coldly. He was completely wrong. She declared the truth once and for all. As he had seen, she was Letitia of the Orlesian family. Both, Belle Poupée and the Ice Dragon Emperor, were her. She explained that she simply changed her form using the ice magic tool. There was no disguise, no infiltration, just one powerful woman mastering two identities to control her world. The revelation left the thug stunned, his worldview shattered by the reality of the monster he had provoked. The air in the fractured chamber hung heavy with the scent of ozone and crushed stone, the aftermath of a power that defied mere political authority. Jagged formations of crystalline spikes erupted from the ground, entrapping the assailants in a prison of translucent, razor-sharp geometric violence. The sheer scale of the destruction rendered the Grand Hall a claustrophobic cage of refracted light and terrified silence. Standing amidst the devastation, Gilbert lowered his arm, the limb partially encased in the very same draconic, crystalline substance that had decimated his enemies. His expression was not one of triumph, but of a cold, resigned pragmatism, his gaze piercing through the surviving thugs who looked upon him with trembling disbelief. One of the trapped men, his face contorted in a mixture of awe and horror, stammered out a question that hung limp in the oppressive atmosphere, asking why Gilbert had chosen this specific moment to reveal his true nature. The thug's confusion was palpable. He could not reconcile the man before him with the image of a mere noble. Gilbert's response was a chilling dismissal of their entire worldview. He explained with a terrifying calmness that the mere prestige and authority of the name, Gilbert, had proven insufficient to command the respect of such lawless rabble. Therefore, he had simply added a necessary supplement, raw, overwhelming force. He flexed the crystallized appendage, the light catching the unnatural facets, and declared that against hooligans who understood only violence, pure, unadulterated power was far more effective than any title or decree. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tension, dripping with an arrogant, possessive confidence. Letitia, standing amidst the wreckage, addressed the paralyzed thugs with a look of supreme disdain. She questioned their intelligence, mocking their need for a logical reason behind her actions. To her, the equation was simple and absolute. This was the establishment her beloved husband had risked his life to protect. As a wife, assisting her husband in such an endeavor was not a choice but a natural law, a self-evident truth that only a fool would question. She gazed down at them, her eyes narrowing, branding them as utterly dense for failing to grasp such a fundamental concept of loyalty. With a sharp, resonant snap of her fingers, the magical energy swirling around Letitia dissipated in a flash of light. The illusion or transformation she had maintained began to unravel, signaling a return to her original form. Gilbert, witnessing the shift, looked up from the floor where the exertion had left him momentarily drained. He watched as the light faded to reveal her true appearance, a transformation that elicited a breathless, stunned reaction from him. A dry, self-deprecating chuckle escaped his lips as he beheld her. He commented on the absurdity of the situation, noting that claiming the title of wife, while possessing such a formidable, perhaps monstrous, form was a bizarre contradiction. Letitia, now fully composed, stood before him, the very picture of elegance despite the surrounding chaos. Gilbert struggled to process the duality, asking if she was truly the same person he had just fought alongside. Letitia confirmed the deception with a calm grace. She explained that to avoid bringing shame upon the Orlesian family name, she had been compelled to conceal her true identity and power. The deception had deeper roots. She revealed that her mother, consumed by the fear that no suitor would ever accept a daughter with such terrifying capabilities, had wept and begged her to hide her true self. It was a lifetime of suppression born from maternal worry, a mask worn to ensure a future that society deemed acceptable. But now, the masquerade had reached its conclusion. Letitia stepped closer to Gilbert, who sat amidst the debris, his posture slumped in exhaustion. She declared that the time for stories and hiding was over. She leaned down, her hair cascading forward, and challenged him directly, asking if there was any reason left to maintain the charade. With a resolute finality, she announced that having found a husband, she would leave her family's home and the stifling expectations that came with it. Her gaze softened as it locked onto his, and she posed the ultimate question, addressing him as her beloved husband, and asking if he still intended to marry her, now that everything was laid bare. Gilbert looked up, his eyes wide and vulnerable, reflecting a turmoil of emotions. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it approached her face, mesmerized by her eyes. To him, those eyes were a source of fear, a curse that had defined his existence. He hesitated, his internal monologue revealing the depth of his trauma. He feared that his gaze was a blight, something that would bring misfortune or repulsion to anyone who looked too closely. He warned her, his voice barely a whisper, asking if she was truly okay with this, if she could stand to be scrutinized by the cursed eyes of a monster. Letitia did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, her expression shifting to one of profound tenderness. She rejected his definition of his curse immediately. To her, those eyes were not a plague but the most beautiful things in the world. She admitted that she was the type of person who needed to see things for herself to make a decision, refusing to rely on rumors or the fearful whispers of others. She had investigated him on her own, looked past the stories her father had told her, and found the truth to be radically different. She chastised the world for its rudeness, declaring it an insult to call something so breathtaking a curse. Her confession continued, stripping away his defenses layer by layer. She told him that she had fallen for him so deeply that she could no longer bear it. She acknowledged his tendency toward negative thinking, attributing it to the heavy burden of the so-called curse he had carried for so long. But she dismissed his pessimism as merely a clumsy aspect of his personality, a personal quirk rather than a fatal flaw. She vowed to accept all of him, the hidden parts, the trauma, the awkwardness in relying on others. She gently mocked his attempt to hide his emotions, telling him that keeping his feelings locked inside was no longer necessary. Gilbert, tears welling in his eyes, looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming relief. Letitia smiled, a radiant, comforting expression that promised salvation. She urged him to rely on her freely, to let go of the solitary burden he had carried for so long. She made a solemn vow, her face inches from his, that she would absolutely, undeniably make him happy. It was not a request, but a statement of fact. She added a playful, possessive threat. Even if he claimed he couldn't rely on her, she would force him to do so. She reassured him that there was no need for anxiety, that she would handle everything. Gilbert, overwhelmed by this aggressive affection, looked away, his face flushed. He mumbled that being told to suddenly rely on someone was difficult for him, a habit hard to break after years of isolation. Letitia, sensing his hesitation, shifted instantly from comforting saviors to a more predatory, intense demeanor. A dark, alluring shadow crossed her face as she contemplated his resistance. She pressed him, asking exactly how she should force him if he wouldn't comply willingly. Her eyes gleamed with a mix of mischief and dangerous intent as she mused aloud about which method would be best to break down his walls. She leaned in closer, whispering that perhaps she should let Gilbert himself choose the method of his own coercion. The intimate atmosphere was shattered by the groan of a thug who had been encased in the crystals nearby. The bald man, sweating profusely within his jagged prison, awkwardly tried to interrupt, asking if they could perhaps leave the flirting for later. He tried to get their attention, his voice trembling. Letitia's expression snapped from seductive to annoyed. She didn't even turn to face him fully, simply radiating a terrifying aura of irritation at the interruption. The thug, misreading the room entirely, made a crude joke, asking if perhaps Gilbert preferred to be silenced by absolute zero, freezing, a desperate attempt at levity in the face of death. Letitia silenced him with a glance that promised pain. She coldly informed him that she was in the middle of courting her husband and that he needed to shut his mouth and wait his turn. The thug, terrified by the shift in her demeanor, immediately fell silent, tears streaming down his face. Turning her attention back to Gilbert, Letitia resumed her interrogation of his desires. She asked him, with renewed intensity, if there was anything, absolutely anything, he wished for. She encouraged him to speak his mind, to hide nothing from her. She promised that whatever he wanted, whatever he desired, she would grant it. Her offer was total and unconditional. Gilbert hesitated, his voice trembling. He stammered, struggling to articulate a need that felt childish and embarrassing. Finally, the words spilled out. He wanted a head pat. He wanted her to praise him. He wanted, just once, to be told that he had done well, that he was worthy of being there. He confessed that he wanted to be treated like a good boy, to be validated for his existence. He squeezed his eyes shut, the shame of his request washing over him. He thought of his cursed eyes, the reason he had been feared and shunned since the moment of his birth. He had never known love, only isolation and the terrified glances of those around him. The weight of that loneliness was crushing, unbearable. All he had ever wanted was for someone to look at him not with fear, but with acceptance. He wanted to be told he was good. A gentle hand landed on his head. The touch was soft, reassuring. Letitia stroked his hair, her expression one of sorrowful understanding mixed with deep affection. She thought to herself how pitiful his wish was, yet how incredibly endearing. She reflected on her own life, on the title, Belle Poupée, beautiful doll, that society had thrust upon her. People saw her as a fragile princess, a doll to be protected and admired from afar. Men had showered her with superficial praise, offering to protect her fragile self, seeing only the mask she wore. But she knew the truth. She was not cute. She was not fragile. She wore a mask of deception, hiding her strength behind a fog of illusions. She had met those superficial offers of protection with a polite smile and cold indifference, ignoring them all. She had never once desired to be protected. However, as long as the rumor of the beautiful doll persisted, she had played the part. Yet, deep down, she had harbored a secret desire, not to be protected, but to protect others. She had never imagined she would find a husband who would love the real her, the person beneath the layers of deception. And now, realizing that her type was actually someone vulnerable and cute, like Gilbert, she felt a surge of overwhelming emotion. She pulled his head into her chest, embracing him tightly. Gilbert was stunned, his face buried in her dress. Letitia's internal monologue descended into a chaotic refrain of love, repeated over and over. She felt like she couldn't stand it. The affection was too strong. She stroked his head vigorously, wondering if this pounding in her chest was what people called heart flutter. She resolved then and there to share all his pain and suffering. She told him he was a good boy, validating him completely. She affirmed that this mutual support was the true meaning of being husband and wife. She praised him for working so hard, for enduring so much. Gilbert, muffled against her, responded with a dutiful yes. Letitia declared that she had decided to protect him for the rest of his life. She warned him never to speak of annulment or breaking their engagement ever again. She commanded him to stay by her side forever, to prepare himself to melt in the warmth of her love. Gilbert, surrendering completely to her embrace, promised he would never leave. The romantic crescendo was abruptly halted by the harsh reality of the room. The thugs, still trapped in the crystals, watched the display with deadpan expressions. One of them finally spoke up, asking, "What about us?" They had been completely ignored during the lovers' reconciliation. Letitia pulled away from Gilbert, her demeanor shifting instantly back to cold, aristocratic efficiency. She straightened her dress and addressed the criminals. She deduced that while they might not be able to identify the true mastermind behind the attack immediately, these thugs would certainly yield some useful information. She decided that handing them over to her father, Adolphe, for processing, would be the most effective course of action. She reasoned that if she handed them to the Imperial Guard, the incident might be covered up by powerful figures pulling the strings from above. That was unacceptable. She turned a terrifying, closed-eyed smile toward the prisoners. The thugs stammered, realizing that sending them to her house meant a fate worse than death. Letitia giggled, a sound that sent shivers down their spines. She mocked their question, stating that the answer to how they would be transported was painfully obvious. She raised her hand, magic gathering at her fingertips. She announced she would transport them in the most direct way possible. With a sickening crunch, the crystals encasing the men constricted or moved violently. The room echoed with their screams as they were forcibly handled by her magic. Letitia stood amidst the wailing men, humming a happy tune, looking for all the world like an innocent maiden enjoying a spring breeze, while behind her, men were being crushed. Having dealt with the trash, she turned back to Gilbert. She took his arm, her face beaming with sweetness, and suggested they leave. She noted that Lord Gilbert must be overloaded and needed rest. Gilbert, however, was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes, traumatized by the brutality he had just witnessed. He stammered, pointing back at the scene, unable to reconcile the violence with her smile. Letitia reassured him that he had nothing to fear from her. They walked into the corridor, leaving the carnage behind. Gilbert, his face still flushed red, seemed to be wrestling with a new anxiety. He stammered about inside and experience, his mind clearly racing toward the implications of them being alone together. Letitia paused, realizing he was misunderstanding her intentions. She realized he thought she was dragging him off for something carnal immediately. Gilbert, sweating and blushing furiously, tried to explain that he had no experience with these things. He looked at her with pleading, puppy-dog eyes and asked her to please be gentle with him. He whispered her name, Letitia, with a vulnerability that snapped something inside her. Letitia froze. Her internal monologue screamed again. Cute. Too cute. Her mind became a battlefield. On one shoulder, a tiny devil Letitia urged her to give in to her desires. On the other, a tiny angel Letitia tried to uphold reason. She looked at Gilbert, telling him that making such an expectant face was unfair and put her in a difficult position. Gilbert, confused, asked what? Letitia stepped closer, looming over him against the wall. She claimed that reason had won the internal battle. However, her logic was twisted by desire. She suggested that a private room would be more appropriate for what she wanted to do, implying that the hallway was the only issue, not the act itself. Gilbert sensed the danger instantly. Letitia pinned him with her gaze, her eyes swirling with affection and hunger. She told him that seeing his face full of such expectation made her happy. Gilbert frantically tried to deny it, shouting that it wasn't like that at all. But Letitia wasn't listening to his protests. She caressed his cheek, declaring that she simply wanted to spoil him a little. She leaned in, calling him her adorable husband, completely entranced by his flustered reaction. Without waiting for his consent, she dragged him toward a nearby door. She politely announced to the empty air, or perhaps the maids watching from the shadows, that she would be borrowing a room for a moment. The door slammed shut with a decisive thud. Outside in the hallway, 3 maids stood huddled together, their faces flushed with excitement. One of them fanned herself, exclaiming that it was the first time she had seen the prince with such an expression. They gossiped rapidly, agreeing that despite the rumors of his curse, his face was actually incredibly handsome. Another maid chimed in, admitting she had been shocked initially that the prince's fiancée was the famous Belle Poupée, but now, seeing them together, she realized there was absolutely no problem. They all agreed in unison, sighing with envy and delight, that they completely understood why Letitia was so smitten. The hallway was left buzzing with the aftermath of the couple's intense, chaotic and overwhelmingly sweet departure. The afternoon sun bathed the garden terrace in a warm, golden luminescence, casting long shadows across the intricately set tea table where the air hung heavy with the scent of sugar and freshly baked pastry. A new chapter in the lives of the cursed prince and the beautiful doll had begun, marked not by the clash of magic or political intrigue, but by the quiet, domestic anxiety of a man deeply in love. Gilbert stood by the table, his posture rigid with a nervous energy that betrayed his desperate desire to please, while Letitia sat with the poise of a porcelain doll, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. On the table lay a letter, sealed with heavy wax, its presence acting as a subtle intruder in their private sanctuary. Gilbert, observing the missive, felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his chest, his mind instantly racing to the worst possible conclusions regarding its contents. He looked at Letitia, his voice tinged with a tremor of insecurity as he asked if something troublesome had occurred. However, he quickly pivoted, eager to distract her with the fruits of his labor, presenting the tea service with a flourish that masked his trembling hands. He announced that he had taken it upon himself to bake cookies for their afternoon tea, a labor of love intended solely for her delight. Letitia's response was immediate and radiant. She thanked him, her smile genuine and disarming, assuring him that she had been eagerly awaiting this moment. Yet, the letter remained a focal point of Gilbert's anxiety. A comment from the sidelines, perhaps a reader or an observer, praised the unfolding romance, offering a metaphorical cup of coffee to the team documenting this love story. Gilbert, however, could not shake his internal dread. He muttered that for Letitia, he was now the important one, a status he feared was fragile and temporary. He attempted to broach the subject of the letter again, suggesting they discuss it later, but his insecurity bubbled to the surface. He looked at her, his eyes wide with a vulnerability that contradicted his fearsome reputation, and asked if he was truly the most important person to her. This question was not merely seeking validation, it was a plea from a man who had known only isolation. The scene shifted inward to Gilbert's chaotic thoughts. He stammered, his face flushing a deep crimson, worrying that his behavior was unsightly or embarrassing. His fear was specific and devastating. He believed that if Letitia grew accustomed to his presence and his quirks, the novelty would fade, and her affection would curdle into indifference or dislike. He voiced this fear aloud, dreading the day she might tire of him. Letitia, however, viewed the situation through an entirely different lens. To her, this display of raw vulnerability was not pathetic but exquisitely cute. Her internal monologue revealed a hunger that far outstripped Gilbert's innocent fears. She thought to herself that there was absolutely no chance of her getting bored. On the contrary, once she grew accustomed to their dynamic, she intended to escalate their relationship to more intense levels. She imagined doing things far more vigorous and rough than he could possibly imagine. As she looked at her husband, she reveled in the fact that they were no longer merely engaged but officially married, a change in status that unlocked a world of possibilities. She found his fretful nature utterly adorable, a sharp contrast to the stoic prince the world thought it knew. The narrative then retroceded to a time shortly before this garden idyll, transporting the observer to the opulent, high-ceilinged office of the imperial palace. King Rossman sat upon a plush velvet sofa, engaged in a serious discussion with a distinguished guest. The guest was none other than Duke Orlesian, Letitia's father, who had come to the castle to offer a formal explanation regarding the violent incident at the brothel involving his daughter. The king thanked the Duke for his report, noting the impeccable timing of his arrival. The conversation turned to the whereabouts of the main instigator of that chaos. Duke Orlesian inquired about Prince Gilbert, asking where the boy was, as he was notably absent from the debriefing. The king, looking slightly weary, sighed and remarked that the noble seal, presumably Gilbert, was currently occupied with official duties and would arrive shortly. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the weight of political implications following the National Foundation Day celebrations. Suddenly, a knock echoed against the heavy wooden doors. A voice from the other side apologized for the intrusion, and the doors swung open to reveal Gilbert. However, the prince who entered was not the composed statesman one might expect. He looked disheveled, his breathing slightly ragged, his face flushed with a lingering heat that suggested he had been running, or perhaps engaging in strenuous activity of a different sort. Beside him walked Letitia, looking pristine and composed. King Rossman introduced the guest, though the introduction was hardly necessary. He gestured to the Duke, identifying him as the Duke of Orlesian, Letitia's father. Gilbert's eyes widened in shock as he recognized his new father-in-law, a stammer escaping his lips. He quickly tried to compose himself, straightening his posture and declaring breathlessly that he had done his best to complete his official duties. Letitia, standing beside him, offered a word of praise that felt more like a master rewarding a pet than a wife complimenting a husband. She cooed, calling him a good boy, and noting how truly adorable he was for trying so hard. She praised him directly, adding the honorific, Sama, to his name, though her tone dripped with a doting superiority. Duke Orlesian watched this interaction with a mixture of shock and profound relief. He witnessed his daughter, usually forced to wear a mask of cold perfection, behaving with a natural, uninhibited ease. He turned to the king, tears of joy streaming down his face, and exclaimed that as a father, he was truly overjoyed. He marveled that there existed a person capable of tolerating and accepting everything about Gilbert, implying that Gilbert's reputation was the hurdle, unaware that his daughter was the terrifying one in the relationship. Overwhelmed with emotion, the Duke demanded that the wedding happen immediately, terrified that this miraculous hope for his daughter might vanish if they delayed. Returning to the present tranquility of the garden, Gilbert continued his presentation of the sweets, desperate to impress Letitia and perhaps erase the memory of his earlier awkwardness. He pointed to a tray of Florentines, describing them as crisp and sweet. Next, he showcased the snowballs, promising they would melt in her mouth. He listed the chocolate chip cookies and highlighted a special heart-shaped cookie filled with strawberry jam in the center. As he rambled on about the confectionery, Letitia observed him, her mind wandering to the rapid progression of their relationship. She reflected that only a few weeks had passed between their engagement and their marriage. Gilbert, noticing her silence, faltered. He asked nervously if he was saying something strange. He tried to tempt her further, pointing out that he had even added a chocolate coating to the top of some cookies, knowing her preference for chocolate. He asked her which one she wanted to start with. Gilbert then picked up a cookie, holding it out to her lips, making a soft foo-foo, blowing sound as if cooling a hot dish, though the cookies were room temperature. He looked at her with wide, expectant eyes, sweat beading on his forehead. Letitia gazed back, a playful glint in her eyes. She asked him a pointed question. Didn't he prefer a more mature, beautiful type of woman? Gilbert froze. The memory of his own words, spoken in a futile attempt to appear cool and distant in the past, came crashing back to him. He admitted, defeat coloring his tone, that yes, he had indeed said that. Letitia pressed the advantage, reminding him that he had once claimed that past is past when standing before her. But now, faced with his own hypocrisy, Gilbert could only hang his head in shame, admitting he had been wrong. He begged her not to mind what he had said before. Letitia laughed, a light, teasing sound. She noted that his behavior wasn't exactly a disguise anymore. He was just being his true, clumsy self. She leaned forward and took a bite of the cookie he was still holding, her lips brushing his fingers. She exclaimed that it was delicious. Then, looking him dead in the eye with a sultry, predatory expression, she quoted his own words back to him. Don't spoil her, she can eat by herself. Gilbert flinched as if struck physically. He stammered, his face burning. Letitia giggled, telling him that she occasionally wanted to have days where she could tease him like this. Gilbert, defeated but unable to be angry, grumbled that she was being mean today, but conceded that if she was having fun, then it was acceptable. The playful atmosphere sobered slightly as Letitia brought up the letter again. She noted that while being away from him was painful, a problem had arisen that required resolution. She stated that it was time to settle the trouble that had occurred. Gilbert asked if she was referring to the incident involving her father's potential loss of position. Letitia explained the political landscape. Now that her family was connected to royalty through Gilbert, the Orlesian family, already rumored to manipulate the country from the shadows, was seen as a massive threat. Enemies who wished to eliminate the cursed prince saw the Orlesians as an obstacle to be removed. She deduced that these enemies had begun a campaign of slander and false accusations within the nobility to bring her family down from the inside. Just then, a maid approached, apologizing for the interruption, and presented the letter on a velvet cushion. It was indeed from her father. Letitia opened it, and her expression remained calm. She announced simply that the problem had already been solved. Gilbert, sipping his tea, did not look surprised. He remarked that he had expected as much. He explained his philosophy. Acting openly and directly was often inefficient. Instead, to ensure that the enemies never realized they were being manipulated, one had to arrange the board in secret. He revealed that he had orchestrated events so that all the conspirators were dancing in the palm of his hand, resolving the issue peacefully without a drop of blood needing to be spilled in public view. He casually mentioned that chess was his specialty. Letitia looked at him, all warring with arousal in her gaze. She called him a scary husband, acknowledging his terrifying intelligence. Gilbert, however, deflected the praise with desperate earnestness. He told her that he didn't want even a single second of his time with her to be stolen by such trivial matters. For the sake of preserving their time together, he declared he was willing to do absolutely anything. Letitia, overwhelmed by the intensity of his devotion, joked that he was going to turn her into a widow, implying his heavy love might kill her with happiness. She stroked his face, calling him a good boy again. Gilbert leaned into her touch, his eyes closing in bliss. He asked her, his voice barely a whisper, if she would stay by his side forever. He needed reassurance that she wouldn't abandon him. Letitia's response was a declaration of absolute possession. She told him that she didn't hate his heaviness. She asked rhetorically who else but her could possibly make him happy. More importantly, she confessed that no one but him could satisfy her anymore. Her body and heart were now inextricably bound to him. She could no longer leave him even if she wanted to. She then pivoted to a lighter, yet equally intense topic: his cooking. She praised his skills, expressing relief that he hadn't given up halfway through learning. She admitted that he had thoroughly captured her stomach. Gilbert seized on this, his eyes darkening with a possessive obsession. He began a monologue about human biology. He stated that the human body changes little by little every day. Blood, skin, bone, and muscle are all constantly regenerating. He declared that from now on, he wanted to be the only one preparing her food. His ultimate desire, he revealed, was for her entire physical being to be constituted solely of the food he created. He wanted her to be made of him, in a sense, and to remain by his side for eternity. Letitia, rather than being repulsed by this biological obsession, found it incredibly cute. She laughed, a sound of pure delight. She told him that whether or not she listened to his demands would depend on the circumstances, but she encouraged him to try his best. Suddenly, the air shrieked. A massive, crystalline dragon construct materialized from thin air, lunging toward them with the intent to kill. It was an ambush, a concentrated mass of magical energy compressed into a lethal form. The attackers, having failed in their political schemes and subtle jabs, had resorted to open, brute force. Gilbert barely had time to react, but Letitia did not flinch. With a casual snap of her fingers, she unleashed a wave of force. The invisible impact collided with the dragon construct in midair. The massive entity shattered instantly, dissolving into harmless particles of light before it could even reach the table. Gilbert stared at the dissipation, realizing it was a sniper attack. Letitia sighed, looking more annoyed than threatened. She remarked that compared to the heavy emotional attacks Gilbert launched at her heart, this physical assault was mere child's play. She turned to him, her expression fierce and protective. She swore an oath, as long as she lived, she would protect him. She told him not to worry, not to fear, for she would always be by his side. Gilbert looked at her, his face flushing with gratitude and love. He simply said, accepting her protection. As the adrenaline faded, the conversation returned to their future. Gilbert confessed his true dream. He didn't want power or glory. He simply wanted to live with her in a small, peaceful house. He acknowledged that obtaining such a simple life might be more difficult than seizing the throne itself. Letitia smiled, understanding the irony. She noted that he didn't seem to desire anything grand. As his wife, she was prepared to grant any wish he had. If he wanted to rule as emperor, she would carve a bloody path to the throne for him. But he wanted peace. Gilbert reiterated his plea. He just wanted her to stay with him until he died. He admitted his love was heavy. Letitia laughed again, telling him that it wasn't bad at all. In fact, looking at it from the outside, his obsession was quite cute. Gilbert pushed it further, saying that even after death, he still wanted to be by her side. The narrator closed the scene as the couple sat together in the garden, unbothered by the failed assassination attempt. The road ahead would undoubtedly be piled high with difficulties. Their path was treacherous. But with Letitia's overwhelming power and Gilbert's terrifying intellect, they were a formidable pair. They would sweep aside all obstacles. They would complement each other's weaknesses. This, the narrator concluded, was the story of a newlywed couple living happily ever after. The stillness of the garden was broken only by the rustling of leaves, yet in the mind of the man standing there, a storm of gratitude raged. Gilbert stood silently, his internal monologue drifting through the profound impact of simple, everyday phrases. "How are you? Good night. Good morning." These mundane greetings, offered so freely by Letitia, had become his lifeline. He reflected on the sheer number of times his soul had been salvaged by these few words, realizing that she was the only person who had ever treated him as a human being rather than a monster or a political tool. It was solely because of her existence that he could face forward. It was her influence that allowed him to maintain his sanity and keep his sense of self intact within a world that often rejected him. He looked down at his own hand, clenching it slowly as if trying to physically grasp the reality of his situation. Now, finally, he possessed the ability to hold a tangible happiness within these hands that had known only coldness before. Yet, a melancholy thought intruded upon his joy. He knew that even if he spent his entire life trying, he would never find a way to fully convey the depth of his gratitude to her. The realization brought a pang of sadness, but the overwhelming feeling remained one of thanks, a gratitude so vast that no amount of words would ever suffice. The narrative shifted back in time to the opulent, chandelier-lit halls of the imperial palace, where a grand celebration was underway. Gilbert, dressed in formal attire, walked beside Letitia, his expression apologetic. He murmured an apology for dragging her into such a troublesome event, acknowledging that despite their engagement, he had never truly properly introduced her to this side of his life. Letitia, radiant in her evening gown, dismissed his concern with the pragmatic logic of a devoted spouse. She stated firmly that as his wife, attending such functions by his side was a matter of course. Gilbert reminded her of the context. This was a celebratory banquet for His Highness, Crown Prince Christoph Rossmann. He explained that Christoph was the heir apparent to the throne and Gilbert's own older half-brother, a man of significant standing and power. However, Letitia's mind was occupied by a far more pressing matter than royal lineage. Her thoughts drifted to the domestic bliss she was missing out on. She lamented that attending this party meant they had no time to eat the meal Gilbert had promised to cook. With a look of intense longing, she confessed that she missed his cooking so much she could barely stand it. While the rest of the court celebrated the Crown Prince's brilliant career, Letitia was mentally cataloging the menu she was being denied. The intimate moment was interrupted by a palace official who approached them, announcing that the emperor himself had summoned Gilbert. Gilbert stiffened, the warmth of his conversation with Letitia instantly replaced by the rigidity of duty. He told Letitia to wait, but she immediately protested, insisting that she should accompany him. She argued that she could not let her husband face the emperor alone, her protective instincts flaring. Gilbert cut her off gently but firmly. He leaned in, placing a hand on her head in a gesture of reassurance, telling her not to worry about him and to head to the main hall as commanded. He framed it as an order, though his touch was tender. Letitia, pacified by the head pat and his confident demeanor, relented. She looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes, promising to wait obediently for her beloved husband to return. Gilbert smiled, a rare, genuine expression, and promised he would return immediately, continuing to stroke her hair to soothe her. Leaving Letitia behind, Gilbert entered the private chambers of the Emperor, King Rossmann. The room was heavy with the scent of authority and tension. Gilbert's demeanor shifted entirely. The loving husband vanished, replaced by a cold, cynical prince. He bluntly asked what business the king had with him on such a day. He questioned the king's sanity for summoning him, the cursed prince, instead of the guest of honor, Crown Prince Christoph. King Rossmann, a bearded man with weary eyes, sat in a high-backed chair and chided Gilbert for his coldness. He suggested that on a festive day like this, a private meeting was appropriate. Gilbert retorted that he believed he had already repaid any debts of gratitude he owed to the crown and owed them nothing further. He expressed his desire to leave, stating that the flashy, brilliant world of the court suited the king and the queen, but he preferred the shadows. As Gilbert turned to leave, declaring his intention to return to Letitia as quickly as possible, the king's voice dropped an octave, becoming serious. He commanded Gilbert to wait. He stated that the brilliance of the light casts the deepest shadows, and it was precisely in those shadows where shady business was best discussed. Gilbert paused, his hand on the door, his expression hardening. He refused outright, stating he wanted nothing to do with troublesome matters. The king persisted, asking if Gilbert was aware of the current crisis involving magic stones and the Weiss Republic. Gilbert, his interest piqued against his will, turned back. He acknowledged he knew of it, it was hardly a secret. The narrative then delved into the geopolitical mechanics of their world. Magic stones were essential resources, normally used to power tools that improved daily life, known as magic tools. These stones allowed ordinary people to utilize magical phenomena, like creating fire or water, through simple activation circles engraved on the devices. Because of their scarcity and utility, they were classified as a special resource class. However, these same stones could be weaponized for war, making them a dangerous commodity. The Rossmann Empire took pride in being a leading producer of these stones, while the neighboring Weiss Republic was desperate for them. Consequently, the empire had enforced a strict export ban to the Republic. Recently, however, rumors had surfaced at international conferences claiming that the empire was violating its own treaty and secretly smuggling stones to the Republic. This accusation threatened to spark a war. The king explained that he needed Gilbert to devise a plan to refute these rumors and restore the empire's tarnished reputation. Gilbert scoffed at the request. He pointed out the absurdity of the task, likening it to a probatio diabolica, devil's proof, the impossible task of proving a negative. He argued that instead of wasting time on defense, the king should use the empire's dominance in magic stone production to force trust from other nations. The king shook his head, sliding a stack of documents across the table toward Gilbert. He revealed that the situation wasn't that simple. He confessed that the smugglers were likely high-ranking insiders within the Rossmann Empire itself. Gilbert picked up the documents. His eyes, the dreaded cursed red eyes, scanned the papers with terrifying speed. The text was encrypted, a jumble of nonsensical letters and symbols. Yet, to Gilbert it was clear as day. He processed the coded investigation report instantly. Within seconds, Gilbert looked up, asking if the king was sane. He realized the implication. The smuggling hadn't fully started yet, but the plans were in motion. The king admitted he didn't know who the mole was and couldn't trust his usual advisors. He was asking Gilbert, his estranged son, for help because he had no one else. Gilbert laughed, a dry, mocking sound. He asked if it was really acceptable to entrust such a critical mission to a cursed prince like him. He reminded his father that he was the person most likely to bring about the country's ruin. The king countered, asking if a man enjoying a blissful newlywed life with Letitia would truly want to destroy the kingdom. The king then voiced a dark suspicion. If Gilbert were to destroy the country, it would be because Letitia, the beautiful doll, had seduced and instigated him to do so. Gilbert's demeanor shifted from mockery to intense, defensive aggression. He slammed his hand on the armrest. He told the king that if Letitia had a grievance with the country, she wouldn't use underhanded methods like manipulation. She would crush the country directly, openly, and physically. He asserted that for someone of Letitia's personality, sneaky sabotage was impossible. Then, Gilbert's face softened into a blush as he launched into an unprompted tirade of praise for his wife. He declared Letitia to be the most wonderful, straightforward, cool, lively, and adorable woman in the world. The king sat stunned, watching his terrifying son gush like a love-struck teenager, awkwardly agreeing just to keep the conversation moving. Gilbert stood up, his mind made up. He held the suspect list the king had provided. He noted that while he couldn't be 100% sure the culprit was on the list, it was a start. A cruel, sadistic smile spread across his face as he stated that if he found the traitor, he would strangle them and present them to the king as a gift. He turned to leave, offering a flippant goodbye. As he walked out, he threw a final, mocking gesture over his shoulder, a sarcastic sign of affection, perhaps a finger heart or a blown kiss, accompanied by a silent, mouthing of, "Daddy, I love you," to unsettle the old man one last time. Left alone, King Rossman slumped in his chair, sweating profusely. He marveled at Gilbert's intellect, noting that the boy had memorized the entire encrypted dossier in a single glance. He acknowledged that Gilbert had left all the physical documents behind because he no longer needed them, a testament to the power of those cursed eyes. The king reflected on his son's transformation. He realized that Letitia was the ultimate stabilizer, a sedative for Gilbert's volatile nature. Since finding a partner, Gilbert had become proactive in state affairs, contributing to the nation's stability solely to protect his peaceful life with her. However, a chill ran down the king's spine as he recalled the look in Gilbert's eyes during their conversation. It was a look of such profound, beautiful, and terrifying emptiness that it sucked the soul out of anyone who met it. It was a look that shouldn't belong to a human. The king shuddered, trying to banish the thought, wondering with a mix of fear and awe just how Letitia managed to handle a monster with eyes like that on a daily basis.